Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a close look at what is really an incredibly complex issue, immigration in the U.S.
Yeah, and we're focusing particularly on the southern border and, the intense debate around undocumented migration.
We've got quite a stack of sources here, research, different analyses, articles covering it from, well, all sorts of angles.
That's right. Political perspectives, economic impacts, even deep dives into potential fraud risks and some real systemic challenges.
So our mission today isn't just to list what the sources say. We want to pull out the key nuggets, the surprising bits, the different viewpoints, really, so you can get a more informed picture.
Kind of a shortcut to understanding these really layered issues.
Exactly. So let's dive right into the political dimension because, wow, the sources make it crystal clear how central immigration has become.
Oh, absolutely. For a lot of voters looking ahead to 2024, it's actually become their number one concern.
Which is a huge shift.
It is. And the sources try to unpack why that's happening now. They point to, well, a historic level of undocumented migration attempts at the southern border. That's definitely part of it.
Okay.
But it's also a more global flow of migrants than maybe we've seen traditionally. And technology seems to play a role, too, making it easier for people to move, to share information.
Right, facilitating things.
Yeah, and you throw in the really deep partisan polarization we're seeing everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it just creates this perfect storm for the issue to really dominate the political conversation.
And you definitely see that polarization in how immigration gets talked about, the rhetoric.
Totally. The sources detail, for instance, a Republican strategy described as leaning into a fear-based narrative.
How so?
It tends to frame things as an us versus them situation.
Yeah.
And it often portrays immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, as a direct physical security threat.
Okay, and do the sources give examples of that?
They do. They mention linking immigration to violent crime, highlighting specific high-profile homicides committed by individuals who are undocumented.
Right, those tragic cases that get a lot of attention.
Exactly. And there's also a narrative discussed that portrays so-called sanctuary cities, places limiting local cooperation with federal immigration enforcement as basically hotspots for crime.
But, and this is important, our sources bring in some counterpoints here, don't they?
Yes, crucially. They include data suggesting that crime rates in sanctuary cities might actually be lower than in comparable non-sanctuary cities.
Lower. That's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe even more striking, there's data indicating immigrants overall have a significantly lower incarceration rate. One source puts it at like 60% lower than U.S.-born individuals.
60% lower. So what does the difference tell us comparing the narratives to the actual data presented in the sources?
Well, it really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? It suggests that while, yes, terrible individual crimes do happen, the broader data doesn't seem to support this blanket claim that immigrants are somehow inherently more criminal.
Right. It forces you to look beyond the specific, often emotional anecdotes to the bigger statistical picture.
Exactly. You have to consider the whole context.
And the sources also mention this framing by some of the situation at the border as an invasion, and that this is sometimes linked to a claim about a strategy to potentially gain votes through illegal voting by undocumented people. That narrative is in the source material.
It is. And while the material also points out very clearly that non-citizens cannot legally vote in federal elections, the fact that this claim persists is, well, it's notable.
Yeah.
And there's a survey finding cited that's quite revealing about public perception. A poll from March 2024 showed nearly 1 in 3 Americans, 32%, believe that even legal immigrants primarily come here to commit crimes.
Wow, even legal immigrants.
Yeah.
That says a lot about the level of concern or maybe misconception.
It really does. And it underscores the point the sources make about the clear partisan divide.
So.
Well, according to the material, Republicans are generally much more likely to view immigration's impact negatively bad for the economy, jobs, taxes, crime, and they're more likely to call the border situation a crisis.
Whereas Democrats, the sources say, are more inclined to see immigrants as an economic benefit.
Generally speaking, yes, that's the trend the sources identify. And that divide really shapes how people see the economic side of things, too.
Okay, well, let's shift to that then. Economics. The sources talk about this idea that immigration deficits, fewer immigrants coming or being able to work legally, have actually led to labor shortages.
Yeah, fewer workers available for jobs. This has apparently felt quite sharply in sectors that have historically relied a lot on immigrant labor. Think healthcare, hospitality, agriculture.
Big sectors.
Huge. The material suggests they're facing pretty significant labor supply issues right now.
And there was an interesting point in there, attributed in one source to Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
Yeah. The argument being that addressing these labor supply constraints, maybe through immigration policy changes, could actually help ease wage pressures.
Meaning it could help reduce inflation.
Potentially, yes. Reduce inflation without necessarily hurting overall employment levels much. It connects immigration directly to those big macroeconomic concerns.
It really shows how tangled these issues are. So economics inevitably leads to taxes.
Always does.
And the sources give some pretty big numbers for taxes paid by undocumented immigrants. Different estimates, though.
Right. One group, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP, estimated it was nearly $97.7 billion back in 2022.
Almost $100 billion.
Yeah. Another group, the American Immigration Council, had a slightly lower figure for that same year, around $76 billion. Still, obviously, a huge amount.
$76 billion. That's a massive contribution to government funds. And one source made the point that some of these taxes, they fund public services, right?
Exactly. Things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, health programs, services that the undocumented immigrants paying into them might not actually be legally able to access or fully benefit from.
But of course, there are counter-arguments presented too. Concerns about financial burdens on citizens.
Definitely. The sources acknowledge those concerns. Things like claims about losses from criminal actions by migrants or, say, costs from car accidents involving drivers who might be unlicensed and uninsured.
So, different angles on the economic costs and benefits.
It's not straightforward. You have these contributions on one side and these potential costs or burdens raised on the other.
Okay, so moving from economics, our sources also really pull back the curtain on another layer: fraud risks and systemic challenges, particularly within large federal programs.
Yeah, this is where the work of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, comes into focus. The GAO is essentially the country's top auditor.
The watchdog.
Pretty much. And they have a specific unit, the Forensic Audits and Investigative Service, FAIs, whose job is basically to hunt down fraud, waste, and abuse in federal government programs. Big job.
And they have a whole framework for managing fraud risks, right? Something called K.
Yeah, commit, assess, design, and implement, and evaluate and adapt. It's their roadmap. The core idea is prevention first, then detection, and then having a solid response ready.
And data analysis is key to that.
Absolutely critical. It's how FAIs follows the money, as they put it. But it's not simple. They know challenges like, having the legal authority, the funding for data systems, skilled people.
Access to the data itself.
Right, access issues.
Yeah.
And, crucially, making sure the data they do get is actually accurate and reliable. Data veracity, they call it.
And the examples the GAO source gives are pretty striking, like finding medical providers listing addresses that were, demolished buildings? Or just mailboxes?
And yeah, mailboxes inside a UPS store listed as a practice location. Things like that pop right out when you analyze the data systematically. Flags a potential problem immediately.
And there was that unbelievable case study about shipping costs.
Oh, the washers. Yeah, from back in 2006, Defense Department. Invoices where the washers themselves cost like 19 cents each.
Okay.
But the shipping cost billed was almost $1 million. $998,798 for shipping 2 19-cent washers.
That's insane.
It is. And over time, that type of issue on similar invoices added up to over $20 million in improper payments. It just shows how powerful systemic data analysis can be in uncovering these huge problems.
And these aren't just historical examples. The sources talk about massive fraud in recent, very large federal programs too, especially the COVID-19 aid.
Oh yeah. The Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, EIDL, and the Unemployment Benefits Program.
What kind of figures are we talking about?
Well, one source cited estimates putting potential fraud in just the SBA programs, that's PPP and EIDL, at over $200 billion.
$200 billion.
Yeah, and potentially over $76 billion in unemployment benefit fraud. The total potential loss across those programs was estimated at maybe around 10% of all the aid given out. It's a staggering amount of money.
And the sources note a lot of this happened early on.
It seems so, yeah. Which maybe points to the difficulty of setting up such huge programs so quickly under pressure. Now, SBA officials have disputed the very highest fraud estimates, but they do acknowledge probable fraud occurred.
And there's a massive backlog of cases.
Huge. The SBA Inspector General's office alone apparently has over 90,000 potential fraud leads waiting for investigation. Just shows the scale.
Okay, so how does this connect back to immigration specifically? One source made a pretty bold claim.
Right. There's a claim in one source that migration economic fraud is likely much higher than some large but unspecified figure often discussed.
Higher than the COVID aid fraud. What's the reasoning given?
The argument presented is basically extreme complexity, deliberate obfuscation, trying to hide things, and potential money laundering through this complex web involving various institutions, NGOs, maybe even cartels.
That idea of complexity certainly echoes what the GAO source said about challenges in tracking fraud in complex systems.
It does. And the GAO really emphasizes data analysis and collaboration sharing info across government agencies, the private sector, other groups. They mention the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Partnership as an example.
Like working together is key to fighting fraud.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the source making that claim about high migration economic fraud also specifically points to a lack of interdepartmental data sharing, particularly in sanctuary cities, as a potential weak spot.
So connecting a lack of data sharing to potential vulnerability, which fits the GAO's point.
Precisely. It lines up with the idea that access and collaboration are vital if you really want to follow the money and spot problems.
And beyond fraud, the sources also talk about how just the complexity of the systems and policies themselves create challenges. Things like catch and release or the stay in Mexico protocols.
Right. Those policies had huge impacts. The material mentions the incredibly long waits asylum seekers faced under stay in Mexico, forced to wait in Mexico, often in dangerous conditions.
Doctors Without Borders, MSF, reported on that vulnerability, right?
They did. Their report really detailed the medical and humanitarian consequences for migrants on the route through Central America and Mexico. They documented violence, despair, serious health issues.
And linked it directly to the policies and conditions migrants face.
Yeah, they draw a direct line between the policies and practices and the suffering they witnessed.
And then there's the legal immigration system itself. The sources point to massive backlogs there, too.
Huge. Approximately 9 million people waiting for green cards, according to the material.
9 million. What does that mean in practice?
It means waiting times can stretch for years, sometimes decades. And a big reason for that, the sources say, is that the annual quotas for certain visas haven't been updated since 1990.
Since 1990, wow.
Yeah, and apparently there just haven't been the votes in Congress to update the system. So you have this system kind of struggling under rules that are over 30 years old.
The sources also mentioned some past policies, specifically under the Trump administration.
Efforts to restrict family-based immigration, big increases in funding for border security, CBP, and interior enforcement, ICE, targeting removals even of migrants without criminal records.
And practices like family separation were mentioned too?
Yes, noting the particularly harsh impact that had on families coming from Central America.
And the sources also note stated plans from some political figures for the future, like large-scale deportations.
Yes. Mentions of potential large-scale deportations and setting up detention camps are in the material, though it also points out the very real practical challenges and capacity limits that were hit in the past when trying to carry out removals on that kind of scale.
Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, pulling from these different sources.
Yeah, quite a few layers.
We looked at that intense political focus, the narratives about security versus the data on things like crime rates. We explored the economic arguments, the tax contributions, the labor supply issues, but also the concerns about costs.
And then we dove into the sheer scale of fraud found in some big federal programs, using the GAO insights on complexity and data.
Which provided some context for that claim about potentially high levels of migration economic fraud, possibly linked to complex networks.
Right. And then the systemic challenges within the legal system itself, those huge backlogs, the old quotas.
And finally, touching on the very real human cost and vulnerability for migrants navigating this whole system, shaped by policies along your journey.
It really drives home that understanding this requires looking at all these pieces, the different perspectives, the data, the claims, the human impact. It's definitely not simple. No, it highlights how interconnected everything is. Policy choices, economic factors, social narratives, system weaknesses, and the people caught in the middle.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, drawing from all this. When you consider the scale of fraud discovered in some of these huge federal programs, and you look at the reality of the legal immigration system with its long waits and outdated rules, and then you see the intense political debate often zeroing in on undocumented status and these narratives of threat, how might all these interconnected challenges fundamentally reshape not just how the public sees immigration, but how the whole system actually functions in the years ahead?
Yeah, that's a big question to think about.